Hello, Neverwinter. My name's Vigilance. This is going to be first time upload for a tank video. I've been with the community for about 5 years now, and mainly just use kind of Twitch as my main platform for streaming, but I'm branching out to YouTube, and I wanted to make you guys a video on what I do with my tank. So for starters, let's look at stats. The big thing with tanks when you're looking at stat building is, what's going to prevent me from taking the most damage. If you're going to be building a tank, the stats that are important are going to be mainly defense, awareness, and crit avoidance, at least as a fighter tank. Defense is going to be direct damage mitigation. Awareness is going to be kind of the counter to combat advantage, which bosses will always have against you. And, also select adds as well. If they get around you and they start to flank you with another ally of theirs, they'll do combat advantage damage to you there as well. And awareness kind of counters that. It's more important for single target fights, though, in my opinion. Crit avoidance, this will reduce your damage taken from critical hits. There's no way to mitigate how often an enemy will critically strike you, but crit avoidance can bring that damage down when that happens. That's your first layer of defense, those three stats. Second layer of defense is going to be your deflect and your deflect severity. And I'll kind of go over what I mean by secondary layer of defense later on. Deflect is how often you deflect an attack and reduce its damage beyond what your defense already does. And deflect severity is how much of that deflect that you had happen is removing some of that damage. So basically when you deflect, it'll take a chunk of damage away depending on your percentage. So I'm going to kind of go over where my resting stats are and what they look like when they're procced, what things are giving me procs, things of that nature. And then I'll follow that into some of the gear that I'm using, some of the companion bonuses I have, where some of these procs are coming from, things like overload enchantments, potions, elixirs, food buffs, both from guild and events, invocation blessings, all that kind of stuff. So things to consider, what stats you gain from your class alone, i.e. things like as a fighter, for instance, when you raise your shield, you get 10% crit avoidance. RB, using your dig-in ability, grants that same bonus, 15%, but this goes towards awareness. So it's kind of important to remember as a fighter, getting a 10% crit avoidance bump just from blocking in general, doesn't matter, RB or using your left click on your joystick. And then that 15% awareness bonus only comes from your dig-in, which is your RB ability. You want to consider stuff like that because it's important not to overcap your stats when you get those stats from said gear. So what you want to look at next is what procs your equipment offer. Things like Fortified Nature as an example. So let's take a Fortified Nature. Fortified Nature, so right now it's currently bugged on one of the aspects of it. It doesn't actually grant you the defense it says it does. Down the road, I can kind of re-spec my character to go around, what that will give. But for right now, I have it built around the fact that it gives awareness and deflect. And I will be touching base as I go through my stats, what those bonuses are and what they add up to pretty soon. But things like this, things like my chest piece, for instance, this gives an extra 7.5 awareness as well as 5% stamina regeneration. So when you have equipment like this that gives you things when it's procced, which is activating it through combat or a specific trigger, those are things to consider into your stats. So let's go back down here. Rounding up total stats is pretty much what I'm getting at. And we're going to start with defense. So right now, currently sitting, it is at 87.6. And it will actually cap at 90%. Whenever I'm critically struck from an attack, there's a bonus that comes from my boots. There you go. Whenever you're struck by a critical strike, you have a 10% chance to increase your max hit points by 20%, which is big. But for the defense purpose, we gain 3% defense here for 10 seconds. You almost are always being critically struck. Again, we can't control how often we're critically hit, but it happens pretty often. When that happens, we have an uptime of 10 seconds. And as soon as that 10 seconds is up, we get another critical hit and immediately proxy again. There's no wait time. So I'm gaining that extra bonus, and that would bring me up to 90%. Actually, a little bit above it, but you can only go up to 90 as your highest. So any little extra you've got before it procs to a 90% is still okay because it's that much more defenses before that proc hits. Let's go to awareness. So this stat for me relies a lot on procs. Definitely relies a lot on procs. You're looking at it right now saying, wow, that's pretty low at 48.6. But don't fret. It jumps up once you see everything that we invest into it and round it up. So for starters, we have the chess piece. I already showed you that, but let's go back to it. Whenever we take a 15% or greater hit against our hit points, we're going to get a 7.5% bump to the awareness, which is big. That happens, and there's no downtime. I mean, yeah, there's a cooldown of 15 seconds, but you got 10 seconds there, so there's a 5-second cooldown. Not a big deal. 15% of my current hit points is about 200,000. So you saw that here on this page up at the very top. And that will go up depending on what food buffs and such I'm using. But the whole point of this is that it doesn't take a lot of hit point damage to proc that chest piece. So it's going to happen pretty often. So you're getting 7.5 there. And then we go over to the Vanguard's Alacrity set. So this is one of the new sets that you can get from the Dragon Hunts. And as soon as I saw it, I fell in love. You'll see why. Looking at the set of 3, when you have all those pieces, you gain per stack 2.5% awareness and 5% deflect severity. That's massive. I don't think I've seen that much stats in a piece of defensive gear for a tank in quite some time. Yes, it doesn't have anything to do with threat generation, but we'll get to that later. Right now we're just looking at how to get your tank stats higher, and this is one of those ways. So the awareness, we're looking at 7.5 coming from this as well. And again, these are through proccing it. So in order to get the 7.5% for using the Vanguard's Alacrity, we have to use our encounter powers. When I go through powers later on, you'll understand why we could proc this a little bit faster. But for now, it's actually pretty easy to get 3 stacks. And it lasts for 5 seconds. Another 12.5% I had mentioned earlier. We get this from Fortified Nature. So again, it's bugged on the defense. Don't worry about the defense part of it. But awareness and deflect work. I've watched and I've tested that against enemies, and that does work and stack up. It triggers every single time that we're hit. And we take strikes a lot as tanks, so that will constantly be proccing. Sure, it fluctuates a lot. I'll give you that. But it's also a part of the bonus, right? You have to kind of calculate that into what your awareness will go to if it's at a max proc. One of the last things I should say is going to be the Chain of Scales. I currently have it equipped, so I can't read you the stats. But one of the biggest parts of that Chain of Scales is it gives you a 3% boost to your awareness. And it lasts for 30 minutes. So definitely something to consider. And then lastly, I consider my block to be a part of that 15% as well. So if you're a fighter, again, this is fighter specific. If you look at the added effect under dig in there on the right, it tells you you gain 15% awareness. That's whenever you're using dig in. Don't forget you've got your normal block, which is clicking in your left joystick. You're only going to gain the crit avoidance from this one, but you get both of that crit avoidance and awareness on the dig in. The reason you get crit avoidance, this comes down to just being a fighter in general. Unshakable shield arm. And this is kind of hidden at the very bottom here, because if I didn't scroll down, this is what your screen normally looks like. It's all the way under feats. So you gotta kind of come down here, highlight that. You'll see increases crit avoidance by 10% when blocking. And that's why it applies to both your standard block and your right bumper block. So at 48% at rest with no buffs for awareness, 51% comes up from having a Chain of Scale, that's 3% there, so 51. Chest piece adds another 7.5 is 58.5. Vanguard's Alacrity set from the neck, waist, and artifact is another 7.5, so that'll bring us up to 66%. The 12.5% being fully procced from Fortified Nature brings us up to 78.5. And then when you use your right bumper dig in ability, that gives another 7.5, so that takes us up to 93.5 awareness. Now, you don't have to have this fully maxed out in order to gain the benefit from it. So let's go down real quick and we'll look at crit avoidance. Rest right now is at 63%. We buffed this selection by doing our companion enhancement. So I'm pretty sure earlier I made sure that it was set. Yes, it gives crit avoidance. And this is whenever we strike. So let's come back here. So companion enhancement gives 7.5. We also gain that 10% that I mentioned from earlier, which is blocking either through dig in or with your joystick. And then lastly, I use an overload enchantment called Unholy Protection. It's actually back here. So right here, it shows crit avoidance and deflect 5%. This, when you put it on, it already factors into your resting stat. So it's not actually adding an extra 5 to me what I currently have at rest. And I've already factored that in when I do the totals here in a minute. But just consider the fact that this is already adding in towards my current crit avoidance stat. It adds up to 80.7 is what I end up having for crit avoidance. Not a lot of procs for crit avoidance because most of that I've already set up for awareness. So you get, again, you get 63 right now, you get 7.5 from the companion enhancement, and an extra 10% for block. So again, 80.7 is where we're at, which is pretty close to cap, right? 90%, we're at 80.7, that's not bad. Especially factoring in that we've already capped out defense and awareness at this point. So this is where I came to what I was talking about earlier, a second layer of defense, right? Our main layer was defense, awareness, crit avoidance. Now, as a fighter, you don't really get a lot of deflect and deflect severity. I've got it boosted up here because of other things I'll mention later, but this is our second layer of defense, which is going to help offset when we're not at full procs for our awareness and our crit avoidance. So whenever that happens, we're going to be deflecting attacks, and it'll deflect it by a specific amount depending on deflect severity. So let's look at deflect. Deflect, while not one of the top 3 stats, in my opinion, it helps in a large way to reduce some of your damage. Mine at rest sits at 51.4, but we have a lot of buffs that proc this stuff, right? So 5% already from factored in comes from that overload we talked about earlier, Unholy Protection. And just having that equipped, it's already got that bonus factored in. We get an additional 12.5% deflect from the Fortified Nature on full proc. And we elected to take Focused Retaliation as one of our boons. You get up to 3 stacks of this because it's per rank. We have 3 ranks, so you're getting an extra 6% deflect. You got Caprice, so let's go over to gear, click into our inventory. Caprice gives 5% deflect. I also used the Mastercraft version of the crafted potions. Unfortunately, I didn't have any +1s to show. This is giving us 4,500 rating. I think it gives you like an extra 500 rating, possibly, if you get a Mastercraft. Which amounts to about 4.5%. Each 1,000 rating is 1%. So, and then we also use Foehammer's Elixir, which gives us an extra 2,000 deflection. So total, we got 6,500 deflection. The one thing you want to make sure is you're not going to overcap on rating because it doesn't give you anything when you overcap. So you come down to deflect here. An extra 6,500 is not going to overcap us. Your rating always caps at whatever your item level is. So what does that bring us to? It's pretty much 2% from Foehammer's Elixir. At rest, we're at 51.4. Then with Fortified Nature giving us 12.5, that gets us to 63.5. Focused Retaliation, another 6% from that gets us to 69.5. Caprice adds another 5, so it's 74.5. The Deflect Potion gives us 4.5 essentially with its rating, and that's 7. And then Foehammer's Elixir bringing us on at the very end for 2%, which is 81% overall deflect. And that's pretty big, since we're not actually speccing into deflect with a lot of our gear and a lot of our companions and stuff like that. That's pretty big as a second line of defense. And that's just determining how often we deflect, which is pretty often, 81% of the time. That's almost every strike. Alright, so deflect severity. Being how much that we deflect of our damage taken from our attacks, right now it's sitting at 32%. Yeah, it's a little low. But for me, this is our dump stat. Even though it's nice, deflect chance takes priority in the second layer of defense because it determines how often we're deflecting. To start off, when I showed off the boons earlier, we talked about the Master Boon being Focused Retaliation, giving deflect a 6% buff. It also does the same for deflect severity. So let's take a look at it just so I can show you. Deflect severity, boom, on the bottom there, rank 3. And we get 3 ranks of that because we chose 3 points into it, so that's 6% deflect severity. We also have further procs coming at a whopping 15%. Because of our Vanguard Alacrity. So again, this is one of the newer pieces. I mentioned it earlier. You probably saw it when we were in here, but you get 5% deflect severity per proc, and you can get it 3 times by using your encounter powers. So 15% deflect severity from just one piece of gear is pretty awesome, in my opinion. So 15% there, and then our Foehammer's Elixir, getting an extra 5% from this. We've got 58% deflect. damage, which is, again, pretty big since we deflect 81% of the time. That's over half of the damage that's done to us when we do deflect is mitigated just from this deflect skill, or deflect severity skill. And again, this is our secondary layer of defense. We're not depending on this to keep ourselves alive and survive. This is to kind of mitigate damage in between the procs that we need for our awareness and our crit avoidance. So just keep in mind that defense, awareness, and crit avoidance as a fighter tank, at least for this build, and what I do, is the main stats that you want to try to spec into. So what contributes to my passives at rest stats? Well, that comes down to gear and a bunch of other things. So let's look into it. Right now, I'm not getting any stats from my helmet. That's just giving me some extra damage. I'll come back and explain the abilities later for things that aren't giving stats. You're getting some of those stats here from the chest piece. These are all, so far, that I've covered from the new dragon hunts. You buy these with the premium pieces that you have to collect from completing those and using modifiers and things of that nature. So you're getting awareness and some stamina regen from the chest piece. Gauntlets, these ones are going to give you some damage resistance. You gain damage when you're struck, and then that stacks up to 5 times, and then whenever you strike an enemy, you get those converted over to damage resistance. So again, no actual stats per se, but you will get the extra defensive bonus of damage resistance out of this if you use it correctly. The Feywood set isn't necessary per se. If you're endgame, it's definitely useful because the more people that run this set in your group, the better. If someone's using the older Masterwork set, it will stack with this. Coming down to the boots, these are the ones that are giving us 3% defense and the extra 20% hit points whenever we're critically struck. The neck and waist and artifact set. So these 3 pieces, you got the first one here, Dragon Scale Neck Guard. You got the Dragon Scale Girdle, and you have to upgrade the Blue Dragon's Mark. Together, these 3 give you that set bonus we were talking about earlier, Vanguard's Alacrity. Ring of Darkness. This one is going to be a bit harder to obtain. You have to do Hardcore Boss, and in that, there's going to be many bosses that you have to fight that drop a Regent. Altogether, you have to collect 4 Regents, 3 from the mini-bosses and 1 from the very final boss. And you elect to make this Ring of Darkness. If you're a tank, it's great to have for your team because it gives a nice debuff to the enemy's accuracy, which means they're dealing less damage not only to you, but to your allies as well. And then it also gives a damage over time. I don't know how it works with threat generation as far as, when you use your powers, your at-wills, encounters, things like that. But, I mean, if Manticore main works for the helmet over here, giving a nice 50% damage to whoever strikes you next after using a daily power. If it works for that and gives you a nice little threat chunk on the threat bar when you're in combat, then I'm sure it works for this as well. And it procs pretty often. Again, 10% chance, that's not too bad. The ring, optional to the Ring of Darkness that I use, this one doesn't give stats per se, but it does give some threat, which is awesome for AoE, running around your targets. Aragon did an awesome video explaining what this ring really does. It's kind of like you're dealing damage to people around you, but you're not actually dealing them damage, you're dealing them threat damage, like the equivalent of how much damage you would be dealing to get that threat. And so I think it had a 30-foot radius on it, if I recall from his video, and very useful for AoE situations. It does give some good stats here as well, if you see that on the top there. Some optional rings. Let's see if I got any more here. I would definitely recommend, I'm not going to use it for my build because it would put me way over, but if you need awareness, getting the Queen's Silver Crown ring from the Vault of Stars, really good one. If you need some extra deflect, Fallen Lord's Tact isn't too bad. If you don't have access to the Dragon Hunts or you don't have the ability to get this ring I was just talking about, the Stalwart Needle Ring of Celerity, you can also get the Ring of the Condemned. It's pretty much the same thing. This comes from Avernus. The other ring that I would recommend, this one's more for Dragon Hunts alone, getting an extra 10% less damage from dragons. That's great. All day long while you're fighting dragons, right? Also works well for Crown of Keldagon. The shirt and pants bonus, again, these are also pieces from the Dragon Hunts. It's useful to tanks in a good way. I mean, you get power, crit severity, and awareness from it. Down there at the bottom, you can see Dwarven Resilience. And as long as you got both those shirt and pants on, you're going to get those bonuses added to your character. So that's gear. Let's look at enchants. Enchants, it's kind of dependent on what you want. Me, I like straight power as a fighter tank. My power sits at 55.8, and as you can see, I'm pretty close to my rating cap. So I can't really get any more from rating. But that's because I've also got 4 offensive enchantments that give power. So I could go into, say, crit strike, critical hit more often, but I like the straight damage from power, and I feel like it's still necessary as a tank. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at that. Next up, we got a couple into awareness, which are the amethyst enchantments. Again, these are all mythic, and a couple into crit avoidance. And if you look at the awareness and crit avoidance, they're not quite at the cap, so you could still go higher on any of these if you wanted to. But just remember also, for things like your deflect, you do have quite a substantial amount. I believe it was 6,500 I mentioned earlier that's going into that. So anything that's giving you ratings, you want to keep an eye on and make sure you're not going over your cap for your rating, which again is also going to be matching your item level. So 81,504 would be our rating cap right now, and that's why we're not in the green on any of that stuff. Which brings me to another point. When you're trying to get your stats set up to where you can get as high as you can, say tier 90s and stuff like that, you don't have to have your ratings in the green. Does it help? Yes, because you're pulling a lot more rating towards that percentage, which is up to 50% if you have it capped. But it's not 100% necessary, as I've just shown you. You can still reach some of your caps without getting your rating all the way up. In fact, I actually prefer to kind of substitute here and there by putting them in several different spots and getting my ratings up across the board instead of all at once, because there's other things too down the road that you can do, for like a mount bonus, for instance. Insignia bonus, I have Cavalry's Warning, and if you look at the bonus there, it says whenever you activate a mount power, you gain 2,000 rating to all your stats for 10 seconds. Well, I can pretty much take 2,000 rating in almost everything except for power, because I'm right there already, but 2,000 extra rating is 2% more stats in all of your stats. So you're getting the benefit of that. If I had things in the green, I would be overcapping it, just like I would be with power, as an example. So I prefer to spread my stats around for reasons like that. You can get extra rating from other things. We left off with gear and enchantments. The other overload I use, this is just kind of dependent on what we're doing. Right now I've got max hit points. Having Fortified Nature, like I mentioned earlier, because of all the different 12.5 amounts I can get for deflect and awareness. Down the road, hopefully they fix this and it doesn't have the bug with defense, and you actually get the defense from this as well. But for now, I'll work with what we got. And I use the movement speed for a tank. It's super important to get to your enemy before your allies do, so you can establish aggro. But there are other options in here. You can do control resistance if you're getting stunned too much, or disabled, knocked down, knocked back, things like that. And for my utility, I use Forte, whereas I went Constitution, Charisma. Again, Constitution, definitely good for hit points and action point gain. Charisma, mainly went this way because it gives recharge speed for your powers to come back, so you can maybe grab the threat sooner. Or for the Forte, getting that extra stats I was talking about. So that's pretty much everything under the character section. Coming over to Boons, don't forget to activate your Stronghold Boons. My Stronghold, we don't really have a whole lot. We're only guild level 15, so don't use mine as a comparison here, but use and pick whatever's going to be best suited for you. At the moment, I'm not even really getting any defensive ones. I'm using incoming healing. Our awareness boon isn't very high at all. We've only got rank 1 at the moment, so I could be getting extra deflect, or I could be getting, extra awareness. So these are all things to factor in, but currently I'm just getting movement speed, incoming healing, and power from my boons. So that leaves a little bit of wiggle room in my build that you guys might be able to do better. For boons on the tier tree with the campaigns and stuff like that, I just recommend going with a good combination of offensive and defensive ones. Obviously, take all your hit points. That's going to give you a good chunk of hit points. Your power, that's going to go straight towards your raw damage and your threat generation. Choose 2. I prefer Forte for the extra stats and stamina regen. But another thing you could really look at is either action point gain if you're trying to go more using dailies, or potentially more recharge speed to get your encounter powers back faster. Just depends on how you want to look at it. Definitely worth investing into Focused Retaliation. again, for those extra stats we were talking about earlier. But I've seen some people go with Bloodlust, gets that extra hit, you know, and the action point gain. And I don't know if it stacks with other people's reduction of defenses for the enemy, but that could be a potential thing as well. I just like, for the survivability reasons, getting your stats in order. Focused Retaliation is by far the better choice, at least for a fighter tank. Alright, so now we're on companions. Right now, as you can see, I'm using the Iron Stone of Radiance, and you can probably see it there in the stats, but at the very bottom here, it tells you get crit avoidance, deflect, and combat advantage. Combat advantage is still pretty important as a tank because you're always putting yourself opposite your DPS, and most of the time your healer as well. And so you're dealing more damage with that combat advantage, right? In addition to that, the crit avoidance bump that you're getting and the deflect bump, with what I went over with stats earlier, this is an important fact that it gives 15,000 or 16,000 in this case, more stats towards those. And it's not putting us over our ratings at all. It's actually putting us pretty close to the top, but not over it. Deflect's at 71, crit avoidance is at 74. We got plenty of wiggle room because we have 81,000 to work with, so that would be about 7,000 for crit avoidance, and we're looking at 10,000 for deflect. We still got plenty to add to that. So you're sitting just fine. Just make sure you're not overcapping your ratings is the big thing. My equipment I'm using as a tank, the ones that give me defense awareness. Pretty self-explanatory, right? I said there was the primary defenses for the fighter tank, which is defense, awareness, crit avoidance. This is giving me that defense and awareness across all three. And it's actually some of the highest item level companion equipment in the game at the moment. So definitely worth having. Get this to Mythic as soon as you can. This gives not only a lot of damage to your striker companions, but it gives you a lot of augment bonus stat as well. So it's 7,500 extra stats. That's pretty large. Companion bonuses. These are the ones I have active, and it's, you know, contributing towards the things I'm currently using. I use Brunor. He gives defense awareness. And again, the Companions of the Hall, each time you use one, it gives a 25% additional bonus to their own bonus. And it's so, like, the fact that 3 of these on right now, I think it's just 3. Yep. The fact that I have 3 of them on is giving me 5.6, whereas originally just having one of them on would give just like what these guys give in single stats. 3.8, I believe it is. Yep, 3.8 stats, just for a single companion. So you're actually getting more stats out of having the Companions of the Hall. And you're getting decent stats. Crit severity, crit chance. The only reason I have this on here is it's bumping up Brunor and Regis's defensive stats. But at the same time, I'm getting a bit of offensive stats, which help with threat generation. So crit chance, crit sev, there you go. I'm right at about 50% on both. So half the time I'm criticaling, and when I do critical, half of that time I'm getting 50% more crit damage. Coming back over here, I'm also using Regis. He's giving me deflect chance, deflect severity. Slime insight. While a lot of people don't like to spec into defense for the percentages, I do, because I like my defense to be as high as I can get it. Golden Goat. This one could be a little bit more trickier to get. They had it on the Zen market, and there's probably some listed on the auction house as well, but they tend to go for pretty expensive AD values. So I wouldn't blame you for going with something else, but for me, this is giving me defense, crit avoidance, and accuracy. While I don't per se need the accuracy, it is giving me a part of that defense and crit avoidance that I need, and that contributed towards the totals that I was giving you guys earlier. So it's totally worth using if you have one. Having Companion in the Hall, they give you those bonus stats. It's more stats than you could typically get if you use someone who just gives you 3.8. So definitely worth investing into if you haven't already. Looking at mounts and collars and insignias, you're going to kind of look at me and maybe squint your eyes and wince a little bit because you're seeing some dominance in there and stuff like that. Just remember, dominance, yes, while it gives power, it also gives forte. And as a tank, forte for me, as a fighter tank, gives defense and crit avoidance. So I am actually still getting some defensive stats on some of these, even though typically you'll find these things on like a DPS character. So brutality is giving a little bit of power, crit severity. I went with that instead because I didn't need the extra defense because my boots gives me that 90%, and I didn't need the extra, dominance stuff giving me the extra defense and crit avoidance because we already went over those stats earlier. I'm already meeting most of my caps on those. So fortitude is going to be your big one. You'll see that often here. Gone sometimes as well. Let's see. Yep, there's a Gon right there. Gon gives combat advantage and hit points. And your fortitudes are giving you defense and hit points as well. So combined, all these with mythics are giving me the stats of where it's putting me currently with what you saw earlier in the video. And for different collars, I went with crit severity because I also have a DPS spec that I use for my fighter. So crit severity works both ways. I went with encounter powers do 4% more damage, but I'm going to tell you right now as a fighter, I'm actually kind of regretting I went with encounter powers. I wish I had at wills. At wills are big for generating a threat, especially with like cleave in an AoE situation as a tank. And then half the time when we're waiting for our cooldowns on a dreadnought DPS spec, we're using our at wills, and that's a lot of our damage is at wills. So if I had the opportunity, I would switch. I've been trying to kind of make a couple trades with people, and encounter powers are currently actually more on the market than at wills, and nobody's really making or wanting to make up for that difference in value when they do a trade with me. So I'm kind of just stuck with what I got for now, and it's at legendary quality. There's not a lot of people with legendaries at the moment. Stamina gain, this goes good for both Dreadnought and for Vanguard specs with the fighter. Having movement speed again is important. Getting to that fight as a tank in this case would be important to establish aggro and keep your threat. And then rough AD for me on this one. It's nothing special. So I love the Pegasus ability, right? Magnificent Inspiration. Not only does it do a 3000 magnitude and an AoE around you, I've seen this thing hit so many enemies. Like, a lot of these have a cap on how many enemies you can hit for AoE. This one, I don't think has that. It's killed way more than the caps on some of the other AoE powers, and it hits everything around it. Half the time, this will just wipe a group out just if you're traveling alone. And then on top of that, you're getting 15% Forte. So you're getting defense and crit avoidance from this one mount power. That'd be what? Half of that would go towards your defense, and then 25% of that Forte would go towards your crit avoidance and your accuracy, which both benefit you because you're not maxed out on them. Your DPS is getting buffed. They're getting extra outgoing damage. Your healer's putting out stronger heals. It's a very good mount to run. There is some optional ones you could run. Bat Swarm for single target is great. Look at all those debuffs and bonuses that it does for your allies and for you. You could do Cauldron Gases if people are running low on their accuracy and combat advantage. The extra DOT is just an added benefit. I like using the Divine Intervention Wing Power. It's great for grabbing threat in a long distance engagement with multiple enemies. It can also do a pushback, so if you don't want them swarming you or your allies, it's great for that as well. Bone Whirl is okay for damage, but it's not necessarily a good one for tanks, but it does a lot of damage. Eclipsed Armament, if you've got the Eclipse line, this is another good debuff for your targets. And sometimes I'll run that, just if depending on if someone else is running something I already have. Tongue Lash is a good single target, so is Tunnel Vision, but again, I don't even have that one leveled up. I don't use those too much on my tank. You could also run Neverwinter Armament. This will help just a little bit, just giving that increases to you though. It's not going to help your allies as much. T-Rex is a great debuff, giving that 15%. And then if you need more survivability, using something like the Griffin Screech. There's two versions. There's the one for the golden one, and there's no one for the armored one. Piercing Screech is the armored one. They both do the same thing, though. It decreases damage coming into you, reduces target outgoing damage by 15%. Gives a nice stun to anybody who's adds in that area, and it gives you some extra stats. Intelligence, Wisdom, and Charisma all increased by 3. So it is giving you some extra stats with that Charisma bump, and Intelligence would matter too much, in my opinion. But those are pretty much the only big ones. If you want to be a self-healing tank, this is a good one to run. Rejuvenating Favor. It's okay, but I don't recommend it in most content that you run. And that's really it for your mount powers. This is a fantastic equip power for tanks. Healers tend to use it every now and then as well because it shares not only 2,250 power and defense to you, but it gives it to everybody around you as well within 80 feet. That's huge. Apart from having what piece that you need for your set in your actual summoned artifacts here as passive, is having different artifacts that give you things like stamina regen. Here we go. Here's one. The Beacon of Silmaril. That gives 15% stamina regen. Now, if I go through and I equipped 3 more that give stamina regen, trying to remember which ones. I think Wheel of Elements. Yep, there's one. And I had one more. Actually, I have 2 more. Mythalar gives 12%, but also the God's Anvil of Creation gives another 15% as well. Let's just say I was running those 3. That's 45% stamina regen just for those artifacts. So if we scroll down here, our stamina regeneration is at 65% right now. That's a lot of stamina regen. So if you're looking for ways to get bonus stamina regen, remember too, I get an extra 5% from my chest piece and some other things. There's a lot of good ways to get extra stamina regen, and that's one of the best ways is artifacts. The bonus is huge on it. You can also go shield talent as well to kind of give an extra 5% buff. But keep in mind, a lot of these are lower item level. These are half of what you'd have from, like, let's say if you had Mythalar active as an example. That give you, 12%, but you're at 1200 item level as well. So you kind of get to pick and choose your battles. What do you need the bonuses on? At wills. I like running Tide of Iron because of the feat that I chose earlier. Like I said, it gives additional damage whenever I attack an enemy that's multiple enemies, like Cleave, for instance. And it also generates more threat for 10 seconds. That's huge. And it does 100 magnitude damage on its own. So if you combine that on an AoE build, you get the Cleave after you start doing your Tide of Iron. That's going to hit everybody for additional damage and generate more threat. If you're looking at your counter powers for AoE, this is actually my typical AoE setup. Enforced Threat's nice because it gives a nice debuff to the awareness of the enemies that it hits by 10%, which means they're taking more damage from your DPS. It also steals the threat as well, placing you on the top of the threat list. So if you're having a hard time maintaining threat, good one to use. Linebreaker, this does increase threat as well. So if you want an ability that's going to jump you up on the threat scale without placing you on the top, Linebreaker is going to be that one that you want to go with. Same thing with Shield Throw. Now granted, this is a single target ability, but with the feat that I have, it reduces it down to about 6 seconds for cooldown. And some of the abilities I have, it reduces it even more based on proccing, certain things like my shirt and pants, for instance, reduces regeneration time on your cooldowns. So I would be able to throw this, I think, about every 4 to 5 seconds. In a single fight, usually you can get it off about 2 to 3 times. And you're increasing your threat against that specific person, just like you would if you hit him with Linebreaker. And, I mean, it hits for a nice amount, too. What was it, 325 for that single target hit? So if you miss somebody with Linebreaker, as an example, you could turn around and hit the other guy you missed with Shield Throw. And it's a ranged attack, so you don't even have to be next to him. Another option you could go with, instead of Enforced Threat, that's the one I typically choose to move in an AoE circumstance. If I don't need to put myself on top of the list or worry about DPS damage because we got some heavy hitters or something, I would recommend going with Shield Slam. Some people are kind of wince at that because it knocks back enemies and whatnot, but you can actually position yourself to get you get to the enemies first because you got all that movement speed. You position yourself opposite your DPS and knock the enemies towards your DPS, right? So you're helping them get to the enemies faster. You're hitting them all, getting that threat generated, doing that 260 magnitude hit to every single one of them. And I find it absolutely useful. Just be careful, though. If you're in a group of guys and they're all standing right there with you, you use Shield Slam and you push them out of the reach of like your Barbarian or your Rogue, they're going to be yelling at you a little bit. So just be careful with it. Bull Charge is another good one, too, especially if you pair it with Cleaving Bull instead of doing the Rising Tide here. This will make it so that you do additional damage with your at-will cleave. So you get yourself into combat with Bull Charge real quick. You start cleaving everything, getting your hits on it, getting that extra damage dealt because of your feat. And then you start popping off Linebreaker, getting that extra threat generated. I still like to keep the Shield Throw on, so use that on something you didn't really hit a whole lot. And you'll hold aggro just fine. You don't really need to use things like Iron Warrior, decreasing your damage taken. Because with the build that we've talked about at the very beginning of this video, you've got the defensive stats. You don't need the damage reduction. And if you're using things like what I showed earlier, getting the extra, say you're fighting a dragon, getting the extra 10% less damage taken from Dragon Ring, that's you don't need the extra 20%. You've already got plenty of damage resistance at that point. So Iron Warrior, not really worth taking unless you're really having a hard time surviving. Maybe you're carrying through, you know, a new healer or something like that, or some low DPS, you're seeing more mechanics. Maybe then, but not typical. Knight's Challenge, this one can be good in circumstances, like in kind of Keldagon, you return some of the damage back to whatever is dealing damage to you. So if you got DOT on you, like in Crown of Keldagon, you get that bleed in the very first step. This would be good for returning some of that damage, but you also get 50% chunk of your stamina back. You lose stamina a lot in that fight in Crown of Keldagon. If you haven't done it before, you're constantly having a bleed stack on you when you trade with the other tank. This would be a good way to get some extra stamina, to block some more, and return some of that damage. But it's very circumstantial, right? How often are you out of stamina? Not usually. So, circumstantial. Anvil of Doom, same thing. While I had mentioned using Bull Charge earlier, if you wanted to have a single target extra hit for a large amount, Anvil of Doom is going to be that one. But the main reason you'd want to use this is to pair it with your class feature, Anvil of Challenge, to place you on top of the threat list. Very good for if you're going to trade, like in Demogorgon or Zariel, with another tank to take a big hit that they would normally die from. So that's, again, circumstantial. Trade it out as you need it, but do I normally put it in my single target or AoE builds? Most of the time, not. Kneebreaker, I don't think I ever slot this thing. Yes, it does a decent magnitude. I mean, Anvil of Doom, it does 880 and can be charged if you do the other feature. Kneebreaker does 650 in a slow. It does last for a long time, but it really isn't that useful, even in a single target instance, unless you really wanted to slow your guy down. I just don't see the use for it, so not typical. Knight's Valor would be the only one out of most of the powers I haven't mentioned so far as being one that would be worth switching out for. This one, the only part of it is that it has a large cooldown. It's great for in single target fights. You got that one guy that just, let's say you got a rogue, super thirsty, getting all that damage with the Band of Air, pulling threat like crazy. You use Knight's Valor, whether it targets him or another ally, you're getting all the threat one of those guys are putting out, and it transfers it to you, on top of what you're already putting out yourself. So this is a great way to maintain aggro, and sometimes even steal it back if someone managed to take it from you. The only trick with this one is you got to watch it, because yes, it does cover the nearest party member and transfers threat, but it also takes all the damage that person would take. So if you're going to pop this around, like let's say a hypo, for instance, like in the very final boss, Vault of Stars. If you pop this during a hypo, you're going to take your damage plus all the damage he would have taken from that hypo. So you want to make sure you're blocking if you put that down when that happens. It could be useful in that regard. If you got someone who can't survive a mechanic and you know that you can, even with what normally you would take, you could try to save that person with this ability. Just make sure that they're the closest person to you. But that's not really what it's intended for. It's mostly for threat generation. So totally circumstantial. Use it mainly for single target. You can use it for AoE. It's not going to really help you in the AoE sense, unless you got somebody tethered that's popping some really good AoE abilities, like a rogue, for instance. And then you want to make sure you're following that person around a little bit. That does kind of pair well with the ring that I have on right now. I just want to mention, if you're running around with that rogue and you're not really attacking much because you're trying to stay close to them, as long as you've got this ring on, you're also generating a threat yourself on top of pulling whatever that rogue had. So, I mean, it can pair well with certain abilities. Daily powers. Right now I've been using Second Wind. Depends on the healer that you got in your group. This one I like to use in the dragon fights, because if you got a weaker healer, this gives you that self-heal option, right? So as you're taking damage, as you're dealing damage, you're getting hit points back. And it kind of keeps you alive a little bit longer without having to stone or in between stoning for health. Earthshaker is great for AoE. A temporary stun, but not 100% necessary. Determination, I'm not a big fan of this one, but it does pair with Perfect Block down here. If you decide to go that route, it's good to use it. Otherwise, I mean, when it says immunity to most control effects, there's still some ones out there that will stun you. There's still some other ones that will knock you back. When it says immunity, it doesn't actually mean immunity, in my opinion. So I don't recommend going that route. Bladed Rampart. This one I love. and I've been set up for dragon hunts recently, so I'm not currently slotted with it. I'd actually probably put it in place of Earthshaker, honestly, but Bladed Rampart's great. It gives you 30% defense if you don't have your defense maxed. I do, so I don't worry about that. But the nice buff is the awareness buff. Pair that with your sharpened senses down here. That's what's giving you that 30% awareness if you haven't already chosen that. The cool part about this too is that it also reflects damage that you're taking for 10 seconds. And that's 260 per hit against you. If you got something that's giving you a DOT, that's a lot of damage you're returning back to that guy. If you're standing in a pool of, let's say fire that someone had put down, you're reflecting that damage back to that person that put that down. There's so many different ways that this attack can do more damage than something like Earthshaker. So consider using Bladed Rampart. It's a great daily ability. And the fact that it buffs your defenses as well by giving you that defense and awareness, it's like the icing on the cake. Phalanx, this one has its limitations. This is, hopefully I get a dev that watches this video down the road and can make a change to this. But when you use this, it's a channel ability. You can't move it all, right? It's most useful in situations like if there's a hypo or at the end of a Lair of the Mad Mage. Everybody kind of groups up on the tank and healer. They'll try to put down some damage resistance. As you can read in the description here, it reduces all damage taken by 20%. Stack that with other things that reduce damage, and it's fantastic. But the limitations on this thing, you could be knocked out of it. You could be stunned out of it. Like, yes, you have immunity to most control effects. But again, there's certain things that a lot of enemies do that can take you out of this phalanx, and it just cancels it. It's like it becomes useless, in my opinion. If you put this up and an enemy knocks you back or knocks you down, it knocks you out of this, and then now you're not giving your allies any damage reduction. You're not giving them any benefits from it. You just wasted it daily. It has its usefulness, like I said, putting it down on like Lair of the Mad Mage at the final boss when he does that big hit after killing all the towers. In instances like that, yes, it's super useful. But if the devs could down the road make an adjustment to it so you can't be stunned, knocked back, knocked down, all these different debuffs that will cancel out your daily, it would have a lot more uses in dungeons. And I think that you would see people running this more often if they were a fighter tank, giving people more survivability in instances, because it's not something that you can be knocked out of. I don't feel like it's working as the developers intended. And with those changes, I think it can make a really big difference with that power. So if I had to pick two powers for you guys to go with, I would recommend Bladed Rampart and Earthshaker. Those are the most circumstantial ones you can use all the time. Second Wind is just going to benefit you if you want more healing, or if you've got a weak healer, like I mentioned earlier. So that's why I didn't choose that as one of the two. But again, super useful as well. Mechanics, we already talked about them. You got your block with your left joystick. Right bumper dig in, that's your best block ever. In fact, I don't ever use block, the standard one, unless I have to do a bit of moving at the same time as I'm blocking, which is pretty rare. If I need to move somewhere, I'm just going to run there, right? Block is actually going to slow me down. So if I want to get away from enemies, or I want to get to somewhere faster, I'm just going to run there. Don't even use block, in my opinion. If you're going to have to block something and you know you're going to take a hit, pop your dig-in ability real quick. It's going to throw down that block. You're going to get 15% awareness, 10% crit avoidance just for being a fighter. And you're going to have a stronger block as a result of that. And if you read it too, it tells you it blocks up to 60% of your max hit points with dig-in. Block only does 40%. So you actually get more stamina benefit from blocking with dig-in than you do with your standard block. Totally useless to use block. Don't even use it unless it's absolute, have to put it down as you're moving away from an enemy kind of thing. Dig in is your go-to. Retaliate, like I said earlier, super useful. 500 to 800, depending on if you go with your Shake It Off, which I tend to like. I'll go over that later why. But super useful to grab threat, that put a good amount of threat out there before your allies even make it to your groups of enemy. You could go in, shield throw an enemy, and that will draw the whole group to you. You just dig in real quick. All it takes is one hit against your shield to activate the ability on Retaliate. You let go of that block, and it hits everybody in a cone in front of you. Super useful. And again, like I said, it does 500 to 800 magnitude, depending on what you chose with the feet down there. That's more than most of your encounter powers, guys. Like if you pop Line Breaker, that's 200. Shield Slam, 260. none of those measure up to dig in and using retaliate. So definitely use your retaliate. It's one of your strongest abilities as a fighter. And it's limitless. Yes, it has a small cooldown, but I mean the 10 seconds goes pretty quick, and then you can just do it again. Pop, get another big threat generation, another big hit. We talked about class features earlier. That's why I run with these two. And I mentioned, some of the other ones that are good to go with. So we're gonna skip those. Feats. I chose why I wanted certain feats, but I'm just gonna re-explain on Shake It Off. You get that extra 300 magnitude when you choose this one. Deep breathing, just you don't get the benefits in an AoE circumstance. So I would recommend, your group is gonna kill them faster than it takes to get your 3 stacks on deep breathing. And so that extra damage you get from this is useless. It's only really good for single target fights. And even then, I still prefer the extra 300 retaliate damage because it does so much more damage on your retaliate, giving you that more threat and helping to melt down your bosses even faster. So that's everything I have to cover on my character. I appreciate you guys tuning in and watching, and thank you very much for your support. Follow, like, subscribe, all that good stuff if you'd like to see more content from me.